Hi, I'm Dr. Andrew Pittman, and this is the timeline video. In the first week of my face-to-face class, we spend the first 3 or 4 days going over a general timeline of Western civilization. To understand music history, one must be able to put that in context with history, generally speaking, because music is a reflection or a mirror of society. And because of that, I think this is important. However, for this video, to keep it under 3 or 4 hours, this is going to be very general and very fast. Anyway, I'm going to try to do this in one take, so this ought to be fun. Okay, just to be clear, I start off with 0. Some people don't understand what that is, but 0, at least our definition of time and how we do our timeline, this is the birth of Christ. Everything before that, we used to say before Christ, but since not everybody in the world is Christian, we now have before Common Era, or BCE. We could go back tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, billions of years actually, because the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. But just in general, we have the Greeks and the Romans, these ancient civilizations taking place before this date. But in our modern timeline here, let me go through important dates after the birth of Christ. So, we have the fall of Rome circa 500 AD. It took about 100 years for that to happen. Why does this matter? Most of Europe plunges into absolute barbarism, okay? I can't even, it's hard for me to convey to students what that would be like, but no government, no police, no banks, no businesses. You can't have a business because someone could just come and kill you for your money. Pretty bad times. Okay, so society collapses, and the only thing kind of saving that is the Catholic Church. So God became the central point during this period of time of sanctity and art and culture. And the church had people that could still read, and they taught you how to read and write, and they kept music and stuff like that. So church was very, very important during the Middle Ages, or the first part of the Middle Ages that we call the Dark Ages. And we still have that thinking today, like if you watch a movie about werewolves or vampires or something, people go into the church for safety. Well, there's a parallel here. During this period of time, it was very dangerous on the streets. People went into the church. But it also changed how people thought. If this was your only form of education, and you asked your dad or a friend or a teacher, like, hey, why is the sky blue? The only answer to that would have been, well, because God wishes it so. They would have offered or felt no need for any other explanation other than that of God. No scientific explanation whatsoever was required. Okay, that will change as we move forward through history. As we get into the High Middle Ages, and by the way, for about, almost 1,000 years, the primary form of music is chant. It does not change much. Because society was not progressing in any other way, the music stayed exactly the same. So, a piece of chant, say from 600 AD, will sound exactly like a piece of chant from 1200 AD. It's kind of amazing. All right, moving forward. High Middle Ages, things begin to change. So number 1, we have the Black Plague or the Black Death, which killed almost half of Europe off. Not quite, but almost. Why does this matter? This is fascinating. If you kill off half of the workforce, it means that employers must pay you more to work. It's a supply and demand thing. So the result of the Black Plague, while terrible, actually resulted in the emergence of almost a middle class. Almost a middle class. And now, if you have a little bit of extra money and you're no longer destitute, you're now willing to think about education for your children. It begins to change your thinking. And so that helps propel us into the Renaissance period. But before that, also, there's something called the Great Schism. This started in 1378. What is the Great Schism? Well, basically, up till this point, we only have one pope, and the pope speaks directly to God. That's how things work. But we have 2, and at one point, 3 different people claiming to be pope. And that begins to shake people's faith, not in God, but in the institution of religion or the Catholic Church. So we have 2 things pushing us away from the Catholic Church fulfilling all needs. We move into now what we call the Renaissance or rebirth. Okay? Some major scientific discoveries, art, culture, music, lots of things. But one of the biggest things that happens here, in 1517, Martin Luther, a Catholic priest, very progressive Catholic priest, tacked on his door in Germany, on the church door, the 95 Theses, also known as 95 Objections to the Practices of the Catholic Church. We spent a lot of time talking about this in the face-to-face, but fundamentally, he didn't think people should have to pay for pardons or forgivenesses, okay? You shouldn't have to spend money to get forgiveness from God. He thought people should be able to read and interpret the Bible on their own, so he translated the Bible into German, or the vernacular for his country. That was a big deal. And also something called priesthood of self, where you shouldn't have to go through a saint or a priest or a bishop to speak to God. You should be able to speak to God directly. A lot of changes. Luther just wanted the Catholic Church reformed. But what happened instead, he got enough people sort of behind him here, we end up having a split. And now we have the Catholic Church and other Protestant denominations. So that would be Lutheran in his case. That's Episcopal, that's Methodist, that's Baptist, that's Presbyterian, and others. So Catholic, Protestant. Why does this matter? Why do we talk about it? Well, the Catholic Church during this time, pretty much everything would have been in Latin, which was not the language of the people. But Protestants felt very strongly that the service and the music should be in the language of people. So now we have music in German, we have music in English. This helps us tell things apart, because before this date it would have all been in Latin for the most part. But also this belief of the Protestants that we ought to have more participation by the congregation. Music had to be somewhat simplified. See, the music of the Catholic Church during the Renaissance was quite complex. So now we get a split here too, where the music is easier. And another thing I do is we take almost a half a class to talk about service wars. I have a lot of experience working for the church, and people really care about the music where they worship. And so there's still this sort of argument. Now it's called traditional versus contemporary music, but it's still the same idea. Do you want lots of rehearsal with professional singers and singing complex harmonies, or do you want, guitars and everybody singing in unison and everything's memorized, and it's just a different way of doing things. So this argument still exists today, whether people realize it or not. Again, that we could spend a whole class on that. All right, moving forward. During the very late Renaissance, people in Italy got together. I'm not going to go into it. That's a long thing too. But they wanted to understand what the Greeks were talking about in their writings. Greeks thought that music had the ability to transform like no other art form, and we didn't know what the music sounded like, but the way that they talked about it, they came to a decision. And so circa 1600, we get the first opera. And all an opera is a play set to music, but it was quite different. The music of the Renaissance would have been music in 4 parts, 6 parts, 8 parts. And that's essentially a small choir. And while very complex and beautiful, it didn't have the ability to emote one's internal feelings very well. You can't really do that with a choir. So we needed solo singing for this. So that's where opera comes in. One person gets up and you hear their inner monologue that we call the soliloquy, their inner feelings, and audiences love it. It was a big change. You got to understand that opera was probably the most important form of music, almost absolutely was, for, at least 300 years. That's what people did with their time. Remember, no iPhones, no television, no radio. People went to work, people went to church, people went to the opera. They gambled at the opera. They found prostitutes at the opera. It was like the whole world. Music was the #1 consumer thing that people did really up until about the 20th century. That's what people did with their time. Okay, moving forward. I know this is taking a long time. So, during the Baroque period of time, you could almost call this the Age of Kings, okay? We have Louis XIV, the Sun King, and during his reign, music was very centered around him, particularly what's called the French Overture. It's da, ta-ta, ta-ta. Okay, it gave this really grand, royal, aristocratic sound, and a lot of the music during the Baroque period has this sort of aristocratic quality to it. Okay, and it can be very busy and triumphant. A lot of people don't like Baroque music. I actually think it's my favorite period of time. But major composers from this period are Handel and Bach. And I forgot to add this. Let me mention maybe the most important work from here is Handel's Messiah, which is the story of Christ's life told through music over 3 hours. You probably know it, at least the Hallelujah chorus, which is the end of the second part. Okay, moving forward, the Baroque period goes until 1750, where Bach dies. But just before that, we have a couple of things changing here. Okay. There's a feeling that aristocratic music and Baroque opera is a little bit too stuffy, and so I believe it's 1733 to be specific. We get La Seva Padrona, written by Pergolesi. It's considered the first opera buffa in the new classical style, as well as Bach's Coffee Cantata. So we move away from this serious aristocratic stuff to more campy, more comedic style opera, which Mozart was really known for. Okay, so we enter the classical period. Some people say it starts in 1750 with the death of Bach. Some people are now arguing 1730s anyway because of these two early operatic type things. Okay, what is the classical era? The classical era is the shortest period that we have here, but it could be the most important, at least historically. So this is the period of time that we call the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, or what I like to call reason over passion. And theoretically, our modern governmental system is based upon the ideals of the Enlightenment, okay? That man is smart enough to determine his own destiny. And so therefore, it is no accident that we get the American Revolution and the French Revolution in the same period of time. Revolution was in the air. It was in the air. We're tired of being controlled by kings. We should be able to self-govern. Et cetera, et cetera. But we have Mozart, we have Haydn, we have Beethoven, although Beethoven helps transition us into the Romantic period. But also during this period of time, this is interesting, we have something called cosmopolitanism. And that is the thought that, hey, we're all more alike than we are different, basically. And so before the classical era, say during the Baroque era, we have German music sounds very German, and Italian music sounds very Italian, and Russian music sounds really Russian. Well, in the classical era, we have a classical, period style. And what this means is that it's really, really hard, if not actually impossible, to tell Mozart apart from Beethoven, apart from Haydn, apart from a Russian composer or an Italian composer. We lost the regional differences because, hey, we're all more alike than we are different, okay? That's really, really interesting. But then comes Beethoven, and although some people say it's his third symphony, Beethoven's fifth symphony, the ba-ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba, that unique motive there, it has such a unique signature that no one would confuse it with Mozart. Instead, people say it just sounds like Beethoven. So now we enter the Romantic era, 1815, 1820, depending on how you want to classify it. But it's fascinating. When we get into Schubert, it is such a stark contrast from the classical era. You will not believe it. You really will not believe it. It's kind of amazing. And so now we move from, hey, we're all more alike and everything's happy, to, no, this is more serious, this is more real, and we begin to have regional differences again. Some people could call this nationalism. And what they do is that people say, hey, we don't want to lose our ethnic heritage. And so they begin to incorporate their folk music or their regional music qualities into their larger compositions. Okay, so Brahms in one of his larger symphonies might have a little bit of his regional sound, or Chopin would have his Polish dance music incorporated into his piano compositions, things like that. Anyhow, but we also have a big contrast between German and Italian. German opera now becomes very, very supernatural. Okay, I won't say ghosts and goblins, but Hansel and Gretel would be kind of an example of that. Anyway, quite different than the Italian opera that's supposed to be more like real life, and that begins to shift. At first, it's a little bit happier with bel canto, but then we move on to what's eventually called verismo, or realism, where basically someone gets stabbed at the end. That's a fascinating period of time. And again, in the face-to-face classes, we would watch big snippets of all this kind of stuff, so you really know what's going on. For most people, the Romantic period is their favorite, and let me tell you why. The film music that you know and love today, particularly John Williams, so the music from Star Wars, the music from Indiana Jones, the music from Superman, etc., is for the most part composed in the Romantic style still, okay? And most of my students, when they start this class face-to-face, they're okay. Then they learn to like the Baroque, because the Baroque's amazing. Classical's kind of fun and campy, and they end up loving the Romantic period. Okay, it's sort of wonderful. Also, we should talk, and I forgot to write this down, we get the late Romantic period. Russian sacred choral music begins to come alive for a number of reasons, but there's a lawsuit with Tchaikovsky, and that broke the mold. And all these oppressed people that have been very oppressed, as particularly with their religious music, the compositions of that are just utterly fascinating. So we have with Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff, it's just wonderful. I don't get to spend enough time with that in this class, but I'm trying to incorporate it a little bit next year. All right. Anyway, we have Verdi, we have Brahms, we have Schubert, we have Puccini, we have Bizet of Carmen, we have Donizetti. There's so many composers during this period. All right, and then finally, we move into the 20th century, and with the 20th century, all bets are off here. Okay, music very early on begins to lose what its function. It's no longer functional harmony in the way that we traditionally understood it. And Debussy plays a key in changing this. There's something called Impressionism. So Impressionism, the art, well, there's a music form of that where things get blurry. So things are still tonal, but we lose our German functional harmony feeling. But then that begins to change, okay? And then in 1913 or 1912, sorry, I can't remember off the moment. I think it's 13. We get Schoenberg's Piero Lunaire, which what did he call it? He called it emancipation of dissonance, but really should be called like emancipation of melody. We get their first taste of atonal music. It's not yet serial yet, but it's atonal. And this kind of makes sense when you think about it, because right around the early 20th century, we've got so much scientific and mathematic discovery going on. And so the music begins to reflect the critical thinking of that time. Anyhow, but we have composers like Copland and Barber and Britten, and oh my gosh, there are many others. And things really begin to change as we move forward here. Hope you can still see me in the picture. But let me just throw out a couple of important dates of the 20th century. So in December 17th, 1903, in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, we have the first flight of a heavier than air aircraft by the Wright brothers. So in North Carolina, they say first in flight, but the guys were actually from Ohio, so Ohio says first in aviation. It's kind of interesting, although a lot of piloting terms are actually in French. So anyhow, but I let you know where the technology is here. A lot of people seem to think this happened, I've heard 500 AD or 2000 BC. No, flight is really pretty young in the history of man. Okay, moving forward, 1914 to 18, we have World War I. In 1917, within that, we have the Russian Revolution. That's a big deal. Also, there was the Spanish flu that killed a lot of young men. Anyhow, 1929. So during the 1920s, we had prohibition, but we called it the Roaring Twenties. The stock market was taking off. Lots of bad financial decisions, though. We talk about that in greater detail here. But we have the crash, and we go into the Great Depression. So the 30s were really, really a bad time for America. Although it turns out people that grew up then ended up living longer, because when you restrict calories, it seems to help people live longer. It's interesting. All right, almost done here. So 1939 to 1945, we have World War II. If you're unsure what these wars are about, particularly this one, we talk about that. I'm finding that a lot of high school students now come to me. They've never even heard of Hitler or Stalin or Mussolini or anything going on during that time. And all I can tell you is that if you forget your history, you're likely to repeat it. So this stuff is really important. You may not understand that when you're young, but as you get older, you will understand how important it is. Okay, that's the basic history timeline, but just want to point out the general dates. This matters for you musically. So we have the Middle Ages, approximately 500 to 1400 AD. Renaissance period, approximately 1400 to 1600. The Baroque period, approximately 1600, we're going to go save 1750. 1750 to 1820 or 1815, somewhere in there, we have the classical era. 1920 to 1900, we have the Romantic era, Romantic period, and then anything after the 1900 to obviously 2000, we have the 20th century. Today, we now call it the 21st century. They used to call this period the modern period, but what do you call something after modern? Postmodern? That's a little bit weird. So that's the timeline. I hope that helps. Important things, again, the split of the Catholic Church, 95 Theses. Don't forget about the Enlightenment, age of reason, reason over passion. Don't forget that a lot of revolutions happened during the classical period, which totally makes sense. the Baroque period, lots of kings, and yeah, that's it. I hope that's helpful to you. We take a test on that in my face-to-face class, but I just want you to be aware of this if you're not, all right? We call this general knowledge. Thank you.